Lane Lyceums are something that have been very traditional in New England, and it's a place where people can share ideas, discuss important topics, debate positions on topics, and we have named our lyceum the Lane Lyceum in honor of Ed Lane, who had such an amazing intellectual curiosity and interested in topics that affected us all. I also would like to ask if people want to be on our mailing list just for the Lane Lyceums. You can put your information in the chat if you did not receive a notice, and I will include you on the next Lane Lyceum notice. So with that, I turn it over to Sarah Elizabeth, who will introduce our speakers for tonight. Okay, Sarah Elizabeth.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much again for coming, and thank you to Amy for that wonderful explanation of lyceums and the history of lyceums, and specifically our Lane Lyceum. Again, thank you all for coming. So this is, as has been billed and advertised, a discussion about reproductive justice, abortion access, and things of that nature, using the movie that came out this past October called Jane as a way to begin that conversation. But please know that this conversation is certainly beyond the movie. So if you've not watched the movie, if you just want to hear about things, we are so glad to have you. Just a couple of notes for how this structure will be just before I invite everyone, or before I invite our wonderful speakers to speak. What we're going to do is I'm going to introduce our speakers. They're going to give us a wonderful presentation, and then we're going to use the last portion of our time until 9 o'clock to answer questions. Now, we're going to ask everyone, because we delightfully have such a large group, that everyone put any questions they may have in the chat box when we get to sort of the time for questions at the end. But if you have a question that is more immediate, like you have a clarifying question about something a speaker is saying, if you're unclear about what information is, if information feels pertinent in the moment, please ask that question in the chat, because I'm sure that Dr. Zinner and Kari Ross would love to answer those questions when it would be helpful. Hopefully that all makes sense. So with that, I am so delighted to have Dr. Tracy Zinner, and oh no, Kari, you've disappeared. You've disappeared on my little thing to highlight you. Oh no, thank you, whoever did that. So grateful. With that, I would love to introduce them. That window closed itself for some reason. So I'm going to have you both introduce yourselves.
We can introduce ourselves
pretty well. I'm so sorry. So Dr. Zinner, would you like to introduce yourself for us?
Sure. I'm Tracy Zinner. I'm an OBGYN. I'm in general practice and have been in practice for roughly 20 years. I did my medical training at Duke for med school, and then came to Boston in the combined Mass General Brigham and Women's residency program, and never left. So I have been affiliated with Brigham and Women since that time, and fortunately have had the opportunity to be trained in abortion care, counseling, be surrounded by people who really are true leaders in the medical side of providing abortions. And so I'm hoping to be able to provide you guys with any medical information and also just review the movie. And I will also say, just for some grounding, and I'll sort of fly through this in my slides, but pronouns are she, her, hers. And I definitely come to this with the lens of being a white, cisgendered, medical, educated, upper middle class person who can only speak to things from my perspective. And there's a lot wider perspective when you talk about reproductive justice that's so important. So with that, turn it over to you, Kari.
Great. I am attorney Kari Ross. I am a practicing attorney here in Boston, even though I take cases statewide, working in legal services, predominantly Social Security benefits and criminal record sealing. However, before law school, and I went to law school with the goal of advancing reproductive justice. I did my undergrad at Salem College, where Sarah Elizabeth went as well. I have worked in abortion clinics, particularly around client counseling and funding. I've also done electoral work, including 2 successful ballot initiative campaigns to defeat personhood amendments in the South. My pronouns are they, them. I'm non-binary. I also am queer, but I am white from a middle-class family, English speaking. I am neurodivergent, but able-bodied and educated. So that's also where I'm approaching this from.
And as I so excited for Tracy and Kari to take this off, this is also a really good point to pause and remind you that this is a great place to get information as a community. But please know that Dr. Zinner and Attorney Ross are not your doctor and your attorney. So there is no legal or medical advice being given at any point. There is community advice and information being shared with one another. So with that disclaimer, Tracy and Kari, please take us away.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and bear with me a moment. Hopefully we're going to get that to all go in a good way. Give me just a moment. I think you guys all see things. All right. All right. So I'm going to kind of fly through some of this first part so that we have plenty of time for discussion. But if you didn't have a chance to see the film, it's okay. If you're interested after this talk in seeing it, you can stream it on Apple TV or Prime Video. It's like $6, not terrible, to pay for it. And then as Amy mentioned, the documentaries are excellent. So Jane, an Abortion Service that was made in 1995 is, I think, available through the public library, that you can download it there for free. I'm going to reference some of the things from the Janes, which was an HBO Max documentary that came out actually the same time as the fictional Call Jane did. So just to give you guys a little bit of information. I have to do a shout out. So Roshan Sethi is a radiation oncologist from the Brigham, and he was the co-writer for this screenplay. So it was, kind of felt like it was coming from my home. Interestingly, the screenplay was written in 2015, but wasn't actually released until October 2022, because it was hard to find a production company that would take it. Abortion is not something that people like to talk about. And, one could say in some ways this was a feel-good movie about abortion. And so I think it took a bit for the political climate to change before people realized that, hey, this is actually going to be something that people are interested in watching. So just as a quick plot summary, so Joy, who's the main character, played by Elizabeth Banks, is a suburban housewife. She becomes pregnant, desired pregnancy, and discovers that she has a cardiac condition that has a 50% mortality rate. She and her husband spend time trying to decide what to do. She decides that she wants to terminate her pregnancy, and is denied the option for termination through the hospital medical board. She goes to kind of finds information from her primary OBGYN about a place she could go to have an illegal abortion, goes there, gets frightened away. And then in somewhat desperation, she finds the telephone number for Jane, and she ultimately calls, gets her termination safely performed, and then pretty quickly gets pulled into the group, and basically starts out as being a driver, kind of non-clinical support for the Jane Collective, eventually becomes an assistant for the procedures, and then ultimately becomes a abortion provider herself. And so very interesting kind of look into the lives of, women who are impacted by lack of choice. And the really hopeful side of it is that it does show the amount of change that can happen from just a few motivated individuals. So that's a quick overview. And so just to center the movie itself, just thinking about the time. So it was 1968, 1969. And to review kind of what reproductive choice was like in the 1960s and 1970s. The first oral contraceptive wasn't released until 1960. So prior to that, people had used all kinds of different methods to try not to get pregnant. Condoms were available, but the pill could only be given to people who were married. And you had to go and ask and sort of prove to the physician that you needed it. Fortunately, that was changed in 1965. And then 1968, the FDA approved several IUDs. And then eventually in 1972, the Supreme Court legalized birth control for unmarried people. But as you can see, that was a time when access to just contraception was incredibly challenging. Interestingly, when you think about the history of abortions in the United States, it wasn't initially illegal. And there was, a history, certainly dating back for probably thousands of years of people using their own herbal remedies, some procedures, and it really didn't become illegal in the US until the 1820s, and then officially illegal across the whole country in 1914. So in the 1960s, when this film was made and when the Janes were gathering together, was a situation that abortions could rarely be performed in the hospital if it was approved, and incredibly rare. Some people were fortunate enough to have physicians who were willing to illegally perform the procedures in their office. As you can imagine, that was oftentimes people who were wealthy, had established care with a provider. Some abortionists that were physicians, some OBGYNs, some surgeons did abortions in their homes, motel rooms. In Chicago, where this movie was set, the mob coordinated a lot of it. It's interesting, everything, when you think about the mob had their finger in everything that was illegal, and that increased the cost for things, and also impacted sort of the fear situation for a lot of women as well as providers. So the other thing I wanted to mention about this time was sort of how the 1960s was a time of change. The federal government had sort of a shifting role. After the World War II, America had been sort of thought of as a global leader and had, wider spread economic prosperity. There's a lot more attention kind of paid to younger people. And so there was sort of a youth movement that was going on during that time. And then specifically thinking about it, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War protest, the gay rights movement, the women's rights movement. And then the actual start of this movie was happening around the time of the Democratic National Convention. And the opening scene sort of shows Joy walking through a hotel as she's been at a event with her husband, and seeing the protest outside, and seeing eventually the police clashing with the folks who were protesting. And so that sort of tells you there was a lot of movement among the people who wanted to make sure that change was happening, and change in a way that honored individuals and respected autonomy. And I think that laid the groundwork for women saying, I'm not going to continue to allow this to happen where I have no choice. So just to review quickly, in the film, these are all fictional characters, but they were absolutely kind of garnered from real life members of the Jane Collective. So Joy was the character that we kind of followed her life. Virginia, that was played by Sigourney Weaver, was someone who was acting as the leader of the Janes, and she was sort of a, confident, go-getter, lifelong activist, and certainly a dynamic character in the movie. Gwen was the only African American character in the film, and was definitely a advocate for racial justice and just reproductive justice in general, and was an incredibly powerful, discerning kind of character. And then person that you probably love to hate as you were watching the film was Dean, who was the physician that they followed. He was definitely corrupt in terms of trying to take as much money as he could for procedures to be done, but he was a safe provider, and so that's sometimes the situation that people had to choose in real life was not necessarily the people they would have wanted to have their procedures performed by, but if they were technically safe, that was what they did. So the Real Jane Collective was officially the Chicago Women's Liberation Union and Abortion Counseling Service. And I kind of flew through this first part. I did want to pause here before I shift into talking more specifically about the real life Janes, and say, were there, for those of you who've seen Call Jane, were there moments in the film that struck you, that particularly, you found yourself feeling it in your heart or thinking about it, later? And feel free to put something in the chat or raise your hand, and we're happy to hear from you guys. Everybody's shy. Well, I will say, for me watching the film, definitely the moments of seeing the fear for her as she was going through and finding her way, and then the points where you saw her gain confidence as sort of an activist, and when she realized that she could make a difference in women's lives, seeing her start to hold, the hand of someone else who was going through an abortion, and then the realization that that she could do the procedures herself. All of those things were really empowering. And then sadly, the times where the group came together and were sharing index cards that had the information about all the folks who had called Jane, and trying to decide who could get the limited procedures done, and trying to compare people's difficult stories, and sort of the voice being, we shouldn't be making a judgment about this. It should be about choice, not about us deciding whether someone has the right to have this procedure or not. So just to move forward, I will hopefully be able to play this for you guys. It's a clip from the, my share sound is on, good. A clip from the Jane's documentary, just a couple of minutes, but just to give you a view of the actual people. So I'm gonna play this, and if it's not working, please tell me.
We were ordinary women trying to save women's lives.
But we were criminals. We were felons. For most of the nation, in '72, abortion was illegal.
We had to go underground.
The woman would be given the address to the front.
It was probably obvious to neighbors what was going on.
We came to the surface from other things, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement.
You couldn't not pay attention to what was going on.
Fetal death is murder.
You could not work as a pregnant woman. If you weren't married, you were out of luck.
They were terrible situations.
The septic abortion word was full every day.
Women did awful things.
They were literally dying because they were women.
So we thought, we can be of use. I said, we could use my phone, but change it so that they don't ask for Eleanor. How about Jane? Nobody's called Jane anymore.
We had the phone numbers on bulletin boards around Chicago. Pregnant, call Jane.
The clientele included daughters, wives, mistresses of police, state's attorney, judges.
It dawned on me how big an issue this was. Jane was an outrageous undertaking by a lot of smart women.
I was not there to pass judgment.
I knew there were women like me.
under the radar of the Chicago mafia and police department.
We were all being watched.
The phone rings. A man says, "We know where you are."
There were 11 counts of conspiracy to commit abortion, 110 years for each of us. So that's a long time. That might have ended Jane right then and there.
I couldn't see myself sitting on the sidelines.
We were building a new world, one woman at a time.
Sometimes you have to stand up to illegitimate authority, and sometimes there are unjust laws that need to be challenged.
All right. So hopefully I'm going to be able to switch off of
trying
this. Great. So just to quickly review a couple of the people that were in that movie, I was struck when I saw the interviews with the women who had been part of the Janes that they're our neighbors. They could be part of our, church community. They were, a lot of them were everyday people. So, Heather Booth, who started the Jane Collective, she was a student. And she had been a civil rights protester. And basically she had a friend in her dorm who was looking for how to get a safe abortion. And she helped that person find a provider. And then that friend told another person who contacted her, who told another person who contacted her. And it kind of trickled down from there. Jody Parsons was the other kind of co-founder and leader of the Jane Collective. She was a full-time kind of activist, but was also married and a mother of two, and part of the ACLU. And I think in some ways that may have been who the Sigourney Weaver character was kind of based on. And then I just wanted to highlight, so Marie Lerner was the only African-American member of the Jane Collective. And she was someone who really stood up for reproductive justice. And she had gotten inspired to join them because she worked for the Chicago's Department of Child and Family Services. And then I just put Eleanor Oliver's name in there because she was the person whose home phone number was used for Jane. So the interesting thing when you look at the documentary is that the first provider that Heather Booth found to do safe terminations was Dr. T.R.M. Howard. And he was an incredibly powerful civil rights leader, physician. He had been a mentor to Medgar Evers. He was a prominent surgeon, had established health clinics for people of color, and was a lead role in the investigation of the death of Emmett Till. He subsequently moved from the South because of all the pressure he received there to Chicago and established a freestanding clinic on the South Side. And basically, Heather Booth looked around and said, okay, who might be willing to do this for us? And was inspired by saying, this is someone who values individual rights. And he provided terminations for the group for a while until he eventually was arrested. So the 7 members of the Jane Collective were arrested, and they ended up were able to post bail, get out. The attorney who was, being their guide through it was a very smart woman. And she knew that, that Roe v. Wade was in the court system and was on its way, to the Supreme Court. And so she just kept delaying. She kept delaying and delaying and finding other ways to give more time, because she knew that if Roe was passed, that folks would be able to have the charges dropped. So she had good success. And so this was sort of the movie's ending when they were very excitedly celebrating Roe. And I guess I will pause there and see if you guys have anything you want to say, thinking through about those things that I just talked about. And then I'll kind of turn things over to Kari very shortly. I put these two quotes up just because I thought they were interesting. Phyllis Nagy was the director, and she, fully recognized that there were limitations to the film Call Jane, but she felt like she was able to approach it in a way that might open up the conversation, which I think is helpful. I will add that I think that this time that we're in right now, particularly thinking sort of, 2020 onward, there's a lot of similarities to the way that people were feeling in the 1960s and kind of how people are feeling right now, advocating for racial justice, feeling upset with our government in lots of ways. And I think hopefully there are different ways that we're going to be able to help change access for patients as we move forward. So I will pause there. Right. Well, I will stop my share, and I didn't know if you want to take over from there, Kari. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Let me remember how to use Zoom and not Teams, because I use Teams most of the time. All right. Okay. One share. And I will warn everybody, I do apologize in advance. There is a 50-50 chance my cat's going to join us in a minute. All right. So let's actually start talking about the decision of Roe v. Wade. So what did Roe v. Wade actually do in 1973? So in Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court held that laws banning abortion violated a woman's right to privacy that is implied in the 9th and or 14th Amendment. I put an asterisk there because they didn't actually pick where it was. They just said, well, there's a right to privacy in the 9th Amendment, and in the 14th Amendment, it's got to be one of those. And under the initial legal framework set by Roe, because before there wasn't a legal framework, the states were just doing these things, as Tracy mentioned, it had been around for a long time, but then states started putting their individual bans on, kind of like what we're seeing now. And under Roe, the framework that they established was that states could only regulate abortion to promote a woman's health prior to the 3rd trimester. So this was basically trying to say it has to be safe. It can't be just anyone doing it, trying to really cut it like the back alley kind of nature that people were associating with abortion at the time. And I hate to say it, that's kind of the broadest overarching legal framework that we had, with the most options. Now that all changed in 1992 with Planned Parenthood v. Casey. The Supreme Court did affirm that the right to privacy included abortion, but replaced the trimester framework with this really vague undue burden standard, which was basically saying that states cannot put in substantial obstacles to getting care that are so unrelated to health and safety that they present an undue burden on the right to a procedure. Again, those are all kind of mumbo jumbo words, but that became a very vague, very pervasive framework, and gave more power back to the states to try to limit abortion, arguably, or they could have expanded it. Most didn't, though. Okay. All right. And then so following up from that, Whole Women's Health v. Helderstedt, 2016. Folks may remember this case as being one of the more recent ones. This did reaffirm abortion as a right to privacy, still under the Casey framework. And in this, the court rejected a specific law out of Texas that was a targeted regulation of abortion providers law. They didn't call it that, but these were popping up all over the states as a way to be like, well, no, we are just trying to make sure that abortion is safe, that, we just want to make sure it's not these back alley clinics. It's not just some dark alley Planned Parenthood, because they always like to put the blame on Planned Parenthood. But what these were unnecessary health regulations that were basically designed as regulations that no functioning abortion clinic in the state could meet. They often required abortion clinics to be ambulatory surgical centers, and even those that were ambulatory surgical centers, there were specific provisions put in there to like how wide your door frame had to be, how many different entrances you had, what kind of locks there had to be on there, and designed in such that even those clinics that were ambulatory surgical centers couldn't meet this. So that's kind of where Roe was, kind of led us up today. But it's important to note that Roe did not do anything to protect providers and clinics from extremist harassment. And it also didn't do anything to protect patients from experiencing harassment or being able to afford and access procedures. You know, multiple doctors have been murdered because specifically they provided abortion care. I believe the most recent one, or at least one that was definitely kind of my wake-up call, was the murder of Dr. George Tiller. He was shot point blank by an anti-abortion extremist in his own church. Clinics were routinely bombed and subject to butyric acid attacks. And there has been some work around this. There is the FACE Act, the Federal Access to Clinic Entrances Act, which also covers churches, ironically. That's how they got it passed. But it didn't do anything to actually protect from the violence. And then there's federal law, the Hyde Amendment, which blocks federal funding for abortion care, which disproportionately impacts people of color, low-income communities, disabled individuals from being able to afford abortion care. And while Texas's trap law was ruled unconstitutional and several others were, they also did their job of shuttering clinic doors. So there are many who are in medical deserts, not just for abortion care, but for really reproductive health care in general. And let me also backtrack a bit. Why do I make a point that Roe only did certain things, and why this is a discussion on reproductive justice? So reproductive rights is a different way of talking about reproductive care, health, and livelihood than reproductive justice. Reproductive justice is, as defined by Sister Song, which is a collective led by women of color in the South, the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, not have children, and to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. I think I actually must have missed a slide in there, but that's okay. I will keep talking. So the framework of reproductive justice came out kind of in the 1990s as women of color, particularly Black women, were noticing how they had been left behind in a lot of the discourse around contraceptive access, abortion access, equal pay, equal rights, and right to health care. And also had, when they were in those spaces, white activists in the area kind of dismissed the historical racism experienced by communities of color and their families. For those who watched the movie called Jane, when Gwen, who is the Black member of the collective, speaks out about why, you know, the 2 free procedures that they have a week have been going to rape victims, as necessary and important as those are, but not to like the 11-year-old Black girl who is trying to access a termination, and how Virginia, the lead activist, had alienated the Panther Sisters and the Black Feminist Alliance because she didn't want to engage in a nuanced conversation about Black genocide and how reproductive health had been weaponized in many ways against Black communities as part of slavery, the eugenics movement, and since then. And now, where are we? Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. So in 2018, Mississippi passed a bill banning abortion after 15 weeks with very limited exceptions, and it was signed into law. The only licensed clinic in Mississippi sued. And in 2022, last summer, Justice Alito held in the majority opinion that there was no constitutional right to abortion and that the issue should be decided by the individual states. He didn't overrule the right to privacy. Honestly, that's not something he could have gotten folks on a majority opinion on, but he was able to go and say that the right to privacy does not include abortion. Okay, and I need to go back one. Give me a second. Sorry. All right. So Dobbs outright overruled Roe and Casey. And this is fascinating because the Supreme Court doesn't like to admit it got something wrong. And even when it does admit it got something wrong, it likes to kind of talk its way around it. But Justice Alito, he wasn't holding bar. He was very happy to get rid of these. So what happened was that 13 states had some kind of trigger law or pre-Roe law that was already on the books banning abortion, essentially meaning overnight after the Dobbs decision was released in 13 states, abortion was banned outright. 24 states in total, and that includes the original 13, are expected to ban or extremely limit abortion care because of Dobbs. And in the first 100 days post-Dobbs, 66 clinics in 15 states stopped providing care. And about a third of those closed completely. It wasn't a, we'll call you back when we're open again. Given how significant Roe and Casey had been to the legal doctrine of right to privacy, and that the Supreme Court never, in those opinions, never directly tied it to the 9th or the 14th Amendment, it's questionable what's going to happen now that these cases aren't there. Roe and Casey were actually foundational for the DOMA case and same-sex marriage. And so, and a lot of other things that people don't necessarily think about was they were foundational in that legal concept. And so we don't know what's necessarily going to happen. This is a map posted by Guttmacher Institute that lays out by state where the most and restrictive laws are and the most protective. You can see there's a lot of very restrictive, some restrictive, and they are predominantly located in rural areas and the South, and predominantly communities of color. And, Massachusetts, it's some protected, but, personally, we could always do better. And that, let me pause, because I know I'm a fast talker, especially when I'm talking about this, and say, I didn't see any questions about needing me to clarify anything or that. And so I want to give a space for that if there are any. Okay. All right, I'm going to keep going then until I learn how to use Zoom. All right, so efforts to protect reproductive rights and reproductive justice now. So some states have put laws on the books saying that their state recognizes a right to abortion or that the right to privacy in their state does include abortion. Also, different cities have done this as well, which presents interesting legal challenges, but at least protects the clinics in those states for the time being. There are so many legal challenges. It feels like there's a new one every day, or legislature passing a new ban, a new this, a new that, a new right to abortion bill. And it's fascinating to see it all go. It's terrifying, but there's so many. As this points out, there was a victory in Minnesota Supreme Court, which said that any abortion restrictions that were on the books pre-Roe or that had been, kind of added on to then were unconstitutional. Interestingly enough, South Carolina's Supreme Court just recently also decided that their state constitution protects the right to abortion as a right to privacy, which I don't think many of us were expecting, but it'll be interesting to see what the conservatives in South Carolina try to do with that. There are federal solutions also in the books. I know Vice President Kamala Harris recently had a meeting, with leaders in the movement talking about the litigation regarding the medical abortion medication mifepristone. And there are also federal court cases regarding mifepristone on both sides and around abortion and trap laws on both sides. Many of those haven't gone away. It's a matter of reprioritizing and reframing. And I'm going to also talk down about a different way to protect reproductive rights and reproductive justice is that communities are coming together to call representatives, to protest, to provide mutual aid in the form of abortion funds and reaching out to their clinics to see the best way that they could support, and really trying to provide practical support and educational support to their communities. So what can you do? Tracy, if at any point you want to chime in, please do. But
yeah, and I was gonna say I didn't I skipped over my slide talking about medical abortion. And so just to give some context, a lot of you may already know about the details of it and mifepristone, but to just do a quick review, the current medically recommended approach to medical terminations is a combination of two medications. Mifepristone, that is a progesterone blocker, is the medication that's been in the news. It's typically given 24 hours prior to the second medication. And the second medication is misoprostol. And that's the medication that makes the uterus contract to expel the contents. That medication is also used for gastric ulcers. So it's a little easier to obtain. You can get it in a regular pharmacy. Mifepristone, up until changes that just happened, was not available in a regular pharmacy. So there was a protocol in place that providers had to either have the medication shipped specifically to their office or to their hospital, and the patients physically had to come in to get the medication in the office, and they were supposed to take the medication in front of you. Consent form for them to sign, consent form that the providers had signed saying that they have access to be able to provide safe surgical care if needed, and are well versed in the side effects and responses that patients may have. So lots of extra logistical hoops that patients had to go through. There was a silver lining to the pandemic that happened with medical terminations, that basically when they were telling patients to stay home and not come into their doctor's offices unless it was absolutely an emergency, providers were able to petition the FDA and say, hey, this is an undue burden, basically, to make patients have to come into a provider's office in the middle of a pandemic. And so then they were able to do telehealth visits, and were able to mail the medication to patients. And so that was a win. And that, unfortunately, currently is again in a legal battle in Texas right now, that they are a group of physicians and conservative leaders have come to the Texas legal system and said that mifepristone is not safe and that it should be pulled from the market, even though it has a 20-year track record of incredible safety. And so providers are pivoting and saying, if mifepristone is not available here, there are different ways that people may be able to access it from abroad, including groups like Aid Access that have been shipping medications from places like India, to the US, as well as using a protocol that doesn't use mifepristone at all. You can use misoprostol by itself for a medical termination, but it's less successful. So it goes from being sort of a 90+% successful to more like 80%. So
And the FDA litigation is very interesting because there's the case in the District Court of Texas, which is the conservative case trying to pull mifepristone from the market. About a week or two later, a group of 12 states, various doctors and organizations actually filed a suit in the District Court of Washington State, saying that the telehealth provisions and the emergency provisions that the FDA put in place for COVID, allowing easier access for mifepristone, should become permanent. So you have two completely opposite legal cases at the district court level. Some of that was, I'm sure, not strategic in that it takes a while to put these cases together. But at the same time, that's basically a way to get it fast tracked to the Supreme Court, because there's not going to be a way to reconcile those cases. So the Supreme Court may decide to pick them up earlier than having them go through the whole legal system up to them, but we'll see. But I'd be willing to bet good money that's going to be in front of the Supreme Court very soon. But so what can you do? Because we're not on the Supreme Court. So march, protest, contact your representatives, have conversations with folks, let them know that this is not okay and that abortion access is a right, and is something that every human should be able to access. A big thing, though, for those who can, is to donate, not just to your political, candidates about things that you support, but also literally to clinics, to Planned Parenthood, to those organizations that are on the ground, especially those led by marginalized communities. Or I will always put in a big pitch for donate to your local abortion fund, because they need so much money, and when they run out, they run out. Just like how in Call Jane, at a certain point, they couldn't take any more calls, abortion funds end up in the same position.
Hi, Kari. This is a disembodied voice coming in to ask you, what's an abortion fund? Could you explain a little bit about abortion funds?
I absolutely can. I love abortion funds. So what an abortion fund is very similar to the Jane Collective and what they did in arranging for folks to get to a doctor, have traveled to get a procedure and to get home. Well, what an abortion fund does instead is try to help with the financial burdens of abortion care. So for those who don't have insurance, or whose insurance isn't going to cover it, or even if they could, there's not, they're low income, they're marginalized, they're housing unstable, any of these reasons, they just flat out can't afford the procedure. Abortion funds step in and work with the patients and the clinics to cover what isn't able to be paid for by the patient themselves. Abortion funds also most do, work with patients to help them cover travel costs or childcare costs for when they do have to travel now further away because clinics are closest to them. Abortion funds are very much mutual aid, founded in basically like the Jane Collective of we're going to help ourselves, because no one's going to do it for us, and really step in places and to cover things that fall in the reproductive justice side of things that the law isn't necessarily capable of addressing on its own. So I will always give a big pitch for them, but there's many other ways to donate for folks who can. And if you can't, then that's okay. See about trying to volunteer instead. I see a raised hand. So Ellen, if you want to go ahead.
So I'm just kind of wondering how the law comes down on things like menstrual extraction, and means that maybe some people in alternative healthcare might be using. And I'm not talking a back alley alternative. I'm talking about like with a reputable provider, as somebody who was in this world, we don't learn to do that, but we learn what to avoid in case it could cause a spontaneous abortion. So there's reflexology points, acupuncture, herbal preparations that have been around for like, I don't know, 20, as long as, you know, women have probably been around, you know, we've been doing, that was abortifacients as a whole category of herbs. So I was just kind of wondering, you know, it seems like a gray area for the law, and I'm not suggesting people take, you know, with no experience, take, you know what I mean? I mean, you know, go to a reputable practitioner, but how does the law come down in those states with those alternative methods?
So that is still a question. And that is a primary concern for patients, clinics, funds, national orgs along the way too. Because now that, you know, clinical abortion, you know, doctor office kind of is so far out of reach for many people now, many folks are returning to more traditional methods, to more cultural methods. And it's not quite decided yet. It's going to be kind of on a case-by-case basis in these states that have the most strict bans in place. I did know that recently, like in Texas, because Texas currently has, I think, the most restrictive ban, and that's one of the ones where private citizens could report you if they thought you had an abortion, which is a whole other scheme of things about creating a private right of someone else to get you in criminal trouble. But Texas had one of those. And I know something came out recently about how abortion clinics out of state could kind of breathe a sigh of relief because there was no way to bring them into court for helping a Texas citizen get an abortion across state lines. Basically, I think it actually came from Texas District Court, but that the Texas Constitution and Texas laws couldn't apply to actions for abortion care out of state. So that's not a direct parallel, but that's kind of the gray area that many folks can find themselves in as they turn to alternative, more holistic, cultural, or herbal remedies. Is there's going to unfortunately be a lot of test cases, and they will unfortunately fall on predominantly people of color and people of low income who don't have the resources to get a doctor procedure somewhere else. But we just don't know yet how that's going to work out. There's some glimmers of hope, like the Texas thing, where clinics, funds aren't going to be able to necessarily be held accountable, but that in Texas at least, but that may be different in different states. And of course, that doesn't apply to what happens if someone self-manages their abortion care.
And that's one of the things I was going to say is, you know, some of the alternative self-managed approaches don't have the same success rate. So you worry about individuals being much further along before they have recognized that that they haven't had success with terminating their pregnancy, or coming in to the hospital with significant bleeding because it was an incomplete abortion. And, you know, certainly in Texas, if someone could say, well, you know, if it came out that you had tried to self-induce a termination, they could certainly prosecute you, I think, in that situation. There has definitely been a lot of circulating in the medical community to say, if you're an emergency room physician in one of these states and a woman comes in bleeding, you nod and say, so you're having a miscarriage? And you don't ask them how or why their bleeding started, to sort of try to protect them and protect yourselves. You know, one of the things that I noticed kind of flying up through the chat, one of the questions was kind of, what does Massachusetts have in place? And you might be able to address it more specifically, Kari, but it is reassuring that it's one of the most protective states that right after the Dobbs decision that Governor Baker did sign in, to protect providers and say that that abortions are a right in Massachusetts, and have done a lot to try to protect providers here, that if you were treating a patient from another state, that they wouldn't agree to extradite a provider from here to another state. It is unclear if you then decided to visit your grandmother in Texas, could you be prosecuted? Maybe.
Yeah, there's a lot of gray area, a lot of confusion about it. I have stopped screen share for now. We do have a few more slides that also have abortion resources, such as the local abortion funds here in Massachusetts and different places we can call. But it is at 8:30. We want to have a nice discussion if we can. So one of us can start screen sharing again if it gets to a point where we don't have as many questions or we want to go over to those resources. I will say one thing about the lawsuit that was filed in Washington State. Massachusetts was not one of the states that signed on to that lawsuit, but I hope that they will be added as a party later and that we can kind of make that happen. But
I was going to say, as a resource, Reproductive Equity Now is a activist group in Massachusetts that their website has a lot of good information about sort of what the protections are in Massachusetts, and then also as a collective what they're advocating for to try to help from a reproductive justice lens. And so that's just a good reference. So Reproductive Equity Now. Thank you. Sarah Elizabeth, so good.
That's why I'm here. This is what I do. Well, with that, we do have some questions that are in the chat that I will sort of direct us through because it looks like we're a pause and going into discussion. Then we'll go back to slides. Does that sound good? So both of you? Excellent. So I promise if you've put your question in the chat, it has not been answered. We're going to get to it, but I'm going to order them to help with flow of conversation. So I do want to point to Andrea Grealish's question. In the states that have restrictive abortion access, has the availability of contraception coverage changed?
So I will chime in with legally, not yet. Practically, probably. In that a lot of the same clinics that were and do provide abortion care for many are also where they primarily get any type of reproductive health care, including contraception and wellness checks, STI checks, HIV checks, pap smears, cancer screenings, all of that. So when, I'll speak from personal experience, at least, none of the clinics that I know are absolutely 100% abortion only. They may be 95% abortion care in services that they do provide, but they offer reproductive health care. And so as these clinics were closing in the light of Dobbs, and we were seeing this also with trap laws as they were being implemented, because clinics are closing, people are losing access. Now, on the face of the law, no. Griswold v. Connecticut is still law. Alito didn't get his hands on that yet. The Affordable Care Act protections are still there in terms of requiring contraceptive coverage by insurance. That hasn't changed yet. But, I don't think it's very likely that that'll come up. Do I think it's possible, though, now that Roe and Casey are gone and this right to privacy is questioned a little bit more? Maybe. But much more than the legal side, you just have the practical effect of folks losing access.
And I was going to add, I think fear among providers of, in these states worrying that what they're doing is going to be construed as a termination, as well as kind of the conservative approach of some of the pharmacists. It's been kind of a crazy thing that I've heard and kind of seen people talking about, that things like, IUDs can be used as a post-conception termination in the very early stages. It's actually, placing an IUD will commonly terminate a pregnancy. So when people are, going to have an IUD placed for contraception. A lot of providers have a policy of requiring a pregnancy test so that they don't unintentionally abort a pregnancy. That would obviously be an issue, in a state that has more conservative situations. I think the other thing is that some providers are worried that eventually they're going to come down and say, hey, maybe an IUD actually does cause more terminations than we realize. And I worry, that in some places that might be pulled. In terms of what pharmacies sometimes in conservative areas are doing, methotrexate, which is a chemotherapy agent, also one that's used for certain types of arthritis, is what's used for an ectopic pregnancy to stop progression of a pregnancy that's not going to be able to continue to survive. But there have been post-Dobbs cases of patients going in to get their methotrexate and it being held back and not given to people because the pharmacist thought, they might be using this as an abortifacient, and we don't want to provide that. Interestingly, historically, even in Massachusetts, I prescribed misoprostol for a patient a couple of years ago, and they called me back and said their pharmacist wouldn't give it to them. And that was in Massachusetts.
And that's because of a different law, which is conscious clause and the right of religious refusal, which is very has been litigated extensively, is kind of a gray area in a lot of ways still, but basically what happens is if a pharmacist in particular, that's where a lot of these cases have come up. If a pharmacist has an objection to abortion based off of their personally held religious beliefs, they can refuse to give medication to the patient because it would violate their religious beliefs. And that has, with limitations, been upheld as protected by the First Amendment. Not in all situations, not in all contexts, but there is they're called conscious clause laws, but that grant for pharmaceutical providers and other medical providers the right to deny care that violates their religious beliefs.
Yeah. And a short clarifying point on this conversation, Kari, I really appreciate you bringing in like the practical, like sort of like maybe it hasn't technically changed laws around contraception, but it has changed how people interact, maybe with specifically doctors and more conservative states. I guess my question becomes like, it just is a clarifying point, like that can be used, like this can be used as an excuse, right? Like to hide maybe dishonest like doctor or providers like sort of like opinions, right? If they're like, oh well, the law says like no, like oh we've passed this and it says no abortion, and like I think this contraception actually does cause abortions, like, and so I wonder about if that also comes into the conversations about how certain medical procedures are stretched to fit.
I think it could be, but for me, I think not so much when it comes to the contraception. I think that's a little bit of a harder stretch, but with, oh, this medication might be used to terminate a pregnancy. And I think it kind of parallels in some ways the fury around gender affirming care in more conservative states as well. I think you can make that parallel of, well, this medication we don't know, or this has a 1% chance of terminating a pregnancy if someone takes it while they're pregnant, so they aren't sure. I think we could start to see that more. We might see doctors asking more conservative doctors in more states asking more kind of pointed and targeted questions of like, well, why are you seeking this testing? Why are you seeking this medication? To try to find out the reason intellectually and not just medically.
So we have two questions in the chat that are separate, but are sort of, or a question and a comment that I think are related. So I'm going to read those for the two of you to respond to. What is being considered being put in place to protect rights of patients and Janes in Massachusetts, as an example, or other similar states who provide transportation and shelter to people from Texas, an example? So when people are helping someone else obtain an abortion from a state where maybe that is banned, what is being considered to protect those people? And then also, there is a comment about someone being distressed that there's less activism now, it would seem, than the 80s and 90s when they protested in DC and were escorting women at Planned Parenthood. So if you could also speak to what is being done in general, both maybe at a legal level, medical, like sort of context, as well as activist context, what is being done?
I think I know in Massachusetts the from a medical standpoint that providers who are primary abortion providers are sort of geared up and ready to receive patients, and there has been some uptick in patients traveling from out of state to Massachusetts, but not nearly the number as it is in states that border the other states with more restrictive laws. So I think there is an uptick in people ready to provide care, and the shield laws that Massachusetts has makes providers here feel comfortable that they can provide that care safely without risk of retribution. I don't know if you had other things to.
Yeah. Yes, I do think there's more protection for doctors and other providers who are interested in providing care. The question of patients who travel, that was kind of what was happening with the Texas lawsuit recently of, if a doctor provides an abortion out of state, can that doctor be brought in? But I haven't read the opinion, but it didn't really come into context about patient rights in that aspect. I think that's unfortunately something that there's going to have to be a case brought first to test. I don't think that's really going to be Massachusetts bringing that case, but if a patient from a state where it's banned comes to Massachusetts and goes back and then is prosecuted there, unfortunately, I think I don't have the answer, and I wish I did, because I don't think there's a pretty answer for it. As far as Janes in Massachusetts who might be assisting, I know that's also somewhat questionable of, are they providers? Are they not providers? Are they not, protected in the same way? I personally will also just chime in, that hasn't stopped folks like Emma Fund and the Western Massachusetts Abortion Access Fund. They're ready. They're here for it. They might even be expecting it at some point, but that's not stopping them from what they're doing. And I think that will also have to be a test case, unfortunately. Going down to, activism now, personally, I disagree that there's less activism. I think the activism has changed, though. And I don't think that we're having conversations the same way anymore. I know for me, I'm somewhat younger, while also not, but I went out and I organized on college campuses in Jackson, Mississippi, when they put a personhood ballot initiative on the state
Would you mind
election
clarifying
ballot.
what personhood is? You've just mentioned it. I want to make sure people understand what that is. Thank you.
So a personhood initiative was basically the ultimate anti-Roe piece of law, which would say that life begins at conception, and therefore under the law, ban abortion because a person began at conception, which would have outlawed all abortions at any stage of pregnancy. The one in Mississippi had very, very, very extreme exceptions regarding life, health, and safety of the mother. Very limited, though. And basically you would have to have like the hospital board kind of situation that we saw Joy in the beginning. But yeah, this would have banned abortion in spite of Roe, we would have been kind of where we are so much sooner if that had passed. But I hit boots on the ground 2 weeks before that election. We were expected to lose and lose badly. This was going to become law. We were preparing for it. But in 2 weeks of going out and having conversations with folks in Mississippi, with organizing on college campuses, with door knocking, phone calls, we turned it around and we defeated that initiative in a landslide. The abortion funds that exist now are ongoing and are always looking for volunteers and have grown in many ways. Now, the Emma Fund actually has paid part-time staff because they want folks to be able to support themselves and reproductive justice as well. If, when, how, which is what Lawyers for Reproductive Justice has renamed themselves, has a reproductive legal defense fund, which is basically a hotline for patients to call if they're worried about the legality of their procedures or any legal effects that they could have for seeking abortion care. A lot more is done online now too, because we are so tech advanced as a culture. And so it's not that the activism isn't there, it's that it's changed. But I will say, I don't think I'm seeing conversations as widespread as necessarily they were in the 80s and 90s until now, unfortunately, with Dobbs.
So I want to say we had a question from earlier from John, thanking you both. I will also do the same just briefly. Thank you both so much. And they specifically noted appreciating Kari's discussion of difficulties around advancing reproductive rights without a racial justice lens, that's really important in this work, which you both have sort of spoken to. Could either of you discuss whether you see opportunities for solidarity between abortion rights proponents and the queer/trans community?
I'm more than happy to chime in here in that I do, because a lot of reproductive justice impacts everyone regardless of their gender or sexual identity. But because of, in many ways, mainstream reproductive rights and the mainstream gay rights movement, those nuanced conversations of the intersections between the two have kind of been ignored or downplayed. So the conversations about abortion being a women's issue, it's not. It's a person issue. It's a health issue. I'm non-binary. I would be knocking down, sleeping outside Planned Parenthood's door if I got pregnant. I know exactly the type of care that I would need. But bigger players in reproductive rights movements haven't necessarily had that conversation, or if they have, they're just coming around to it. But the opportunity is there because we are much more alike and in much more similar situations than necessarily you would think, in terms of access to health care, to stigma, to risk of criminalization. I mentioned it a bit earlier, but personally, I don't see how you cannot think about reproductive justice and the reproductive justice movement in the context of the bills banning gender affirming care for patients, and arguably and more targeted at minors. But those parallels are so strong. I don't see how you can really have conversations about one and not the other. So my hope is that those conversations do advance a bit, and we can have those broader conversations. And abortion isn't just a women's issue, and gender affirming care isn't just a trans issue or a gay issue. They're hand in hand.
Now, I will say, in terms of a space that there seems to be a good intersectional kind of conversation on the UUA, Stand on the Side of Love. That group has both been a big sponsor of LGBTQIA rights, and also with the overturning of Dobbs really did a push towards reproductive justice as well. So it's nice to see that some groups are sort of saying, this is the same thing. This is the same, respecting a person and their autonomy and their choice to create the life that is right for them, and not being that someone from the outside tells them what they can and can't do. And I think for me, I was very worried when Roe was overturned, that sort of what that impact would be on the right to privacy and how that would trickle down, as Kari had mentioned, would we lose the right for people to marry who they want to marry, and all the various ways that could trickle down.
Yeah, thank you. So someone asked, is Plan B available or not available in the restricted abortion states? And if also, Dr. Zinner, you wouldn't mind giving a quick synopsis of what Plan B is, because I think there's a lot of question about that.
Yeah, so Plan B, to kind of be clear, is it's Plan B itself is a progesterone. So it's like two-part, when you think about a birth control pill, it's an estrogen and a progesterone most often. It is sort of a higher dose of just progesterone. It does not actually terminate a pregnancy. So it's not actually an abortifacient. What it does is delay ovulation. So if you have not already ovulated, it can delay that. And it also can make the lining of the uterus a little less hospitable for implantation to happen. But if implantation has already happened, it will not terminate a pregnancy. So I don't know if there's been any restrictions placed in Texas. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the way that Plan B works. Now it's available over the counter. You can go without a prescription and get it at CVS or Walgreens. But I do worry that some pharmacies in states where abortion is increasingly restrictive, that people may start to not carry it because they just don't want to deal, kind of with the questions rising.
I'm not aware of any litigation about it yet. I do think, especially now that there's kind of more attention put on abortion restrictions in light of Dobbs, that maybe conscious clauses in certain states like Texas may be getting used a little bit more by pharmacists and other folks to say that they don't want to dispense Plan B because they think it's an abortifacient when it's not. I also would expect that whatever comes out of the litigation regarding the FDA's approval of mifepristone, I have a feeling that will actually come back to affect Plan B if it goes south, if the litigation goes south is what I mean. I could very much see a conservative state taking a decision on the mifepristone case and then trying to say, the same regulations regarding Plan B that the FDA have put in there and all of that, it should apply here too, and try to pull back so much that we've gained in terms of emergency contraceptive access.
Dr. Zinner, I'm gonna, just while we're talking about Plan B, I'm gonna ask a quick question that I mostly know the answer to, but because it's something I care about, I want other people to know the answer to. Are there things about Plan B that are not widely known about the culture that might affect its efficacy, such as someone's weight? But because Plan B is such a taboo conversation in culture, that we don't actually know what some of these restrictions are around its use?
Yeah. And so that's the thing, is both the timing, of taking it, that some people I think are more aware, that you really need to take it ideally within 48 hours after the unplanned or unintended potential conception. But because it is a progesterone and is a medication that the amount in your body changes based on what your BMI is. So, when you think about it, kids, when they're given medications, it's all calculated based on their body weight. And for some bizarre reason, when you become an adult, the medications are all the same. It's like you just get a standard dose. And so unfortunately, they don't have an adjusted dose if someone's BMI is higher. And I think a lot of people don't recognize that. There are other types of medications that can be used similarly to Plan B. Including the mifepristone, itself, that by being a progesterone blocker, that can be helpful. But there are prescription versions of Plan B that are a little bit higher dose that are more effective. So there are some other options that are out there, but that's a really good point that I think people don't oftentimes realize, that there are limitations to it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Couple more questions here. Do you anticipate future decreases, or even I would maybe say current decreases, in OBGYN field generally, people entering that field out of fear or instability?
So it's a really interesting thing. And there's a lot of things online flying around, people worrying about it and all the different factors. An interesting thing right now is that the ACGME, which is the accrediting body for medical education, currently, and they kind of redefined the language as soon as Dobbs came out, but for OBGYN residencies, they are required as a program to provide training in abortion care. And residency programs in states where it is illegal have to provide access for those residents to be able to get training. It is with sort of the conscious objection kind of clause, you may opt out as an OBGYN resident, you may opt out of that training, but they made it very clear that it is an opt-out, not an opt-in. So the default is that you get that training, that training is required. Now, how is that actually going to practically be done? Because as you know, when you look like at the map where the most restrictive laws are, that would mean that residents that are in Texas, which currently the largest OBGYN residency is at UT Southwestern in Texas, they would have to travel several states away to be able to get the surgical training for that. And currently, the way it's written, those residency programs have to provide them with enough monetary support that they could stay somewhere else. The other thing is that the programs in the other states have to be able to find a way to educate these extra bodies that are coming in from other states. And then, of course, there's fear that if you are a resident in Texas and you travel to Massachusetts and do an away rotation to learn, how to do terminations, when you come back, is your neighbor gonna, raise a suit against you, a civil suit against you? So that part is still very much being worked out. And so, what we're hearing from med students is a huge drop in the numbers that are applying to residencies in those states. So, definitely, looking at this year's set of people applying, there's a big drop in the numbers going to conservative states. I think there have been some people who are from more conservative states who would have maybe considered an OBGYN residency and now feel like it's too challenging to navigate. And then there are other people who've taken the opposite, feeling that they're like, no, this is so important, I'm even more driven to do this. So I'm not sure how the numbers eventually will play out, but there's definitely some fear. And I think, you kind of understand it, even if you don't want them to, let the fear choose what they do. But the thought that you can go through all of your education and all of your training and then end up with a felony charge because you were providing healthcare, it's hard. It's hard to stomach.
Thank you. We also have a question about a legal question saying what's happening with cases potentially based on protecting religious freedom for religions that allow abortion. For example, a while back, they heard of a case in Florida raising concern from a Jewish perspective.
So I know that case was filed, but I have not heard anything new about it. So I don't have an update on that one. I do believe that the Satanic Temple filed a similar suit in Texas. And however you feel about the Temple of Satan, they've done some great things regarding First Amendment protections for non-Christian religions, as well as for things like reproductive rights, healthcare, and justice. They're willing to file the lawsuits that a lot of folks don't have the courage to file. So setting that aside, they are a nationally recognized religion, and they have filed a similar case too. I have not heard any other developments on it, but I do know it was filed. And it'll be interesting to see what courts do. I know the Satanic Temple hasn't always been successful on things like this, but they've had a lot of success in other ways. So it'll be interesting to see how courts handle First Amendment protections in contexts like this going forward. But like I said, I know those cases are filed, but I haven't heard any further developments on them yet.
Wonderful. That appears to be the end of the questions that were submitted in the chat. So we are at 9, but I would love for us to go through those last slides and talk about some of those things that people can do. And also please note, everyone, I will make sure that these resources are added to the First Parish and Needham blog post. So the same link that you can use with the Call Jane at the church website will also have the links and the resources that we discussed tonight, and that have been shared in the chat. If you want to find those later.
I can pull up the share screen there, I think. Let me just click through a little bit. So there was these abortion resources was actually put together by one of the OBGYN residencies in Massachusetts, and basically were pooling all the information that they could get into one place, which was lovely. So Plan C is a website for access to getting safe abortion pills. So making sure that you're not ordering them from another country and you're not getting actually, mifepristone and misoprostol. And the I Need an A is a great website for being able to look up and say, okay, where can I get a termination that's done in a safe place? And the National Abortion Federation has a toll-free hotline available for referrals, which is great, so that you can, look up online, can call in and find information. And interestingly, the fourth one on this list, the mahotline.org, is a specific hotline to help people manage their medical terminations, which, in an ideal world, patients would feel connected to be able to call their provider and have really good counseling, but it's also not everyone feels that way. And to have a resource they feel like they can call, I mean, that really is essentially what the Janes were doing. When you watched in Call Jane, after people had their procedure done, they had someone talk to them about, what to expect, what was normal, what they should worry about. And that's what, people who are going through a medical termination or a spontaneous miscarriage need to have, that kind of support and conversation. This kind of goes through with some of the resources that were posted in the chat, like the Emma Fund, the Jane Fund. Those are all great resources. And the abortion funds in Massachusetts. And then, again, the individual abortion funds can supply this, but in Massachusetts, the Healthcare for All, that line, even if you don't have insurance, you can call and they can help you find access, as well as having transportation and helping to work on payment. And same thing as far as the abortion access coordinator, that's a number that people can call and can help support minors as well. So a good resource. And then, along the same lines as kind of counseling support, abortion doulas, help provide practical information as well as emotional support. And so there's a couple different resources that are listed there. And then oh, I had gone back. I'll skip over that actually, but this QR code is actually for the National Network of Abortion Funds, which if you click on that and go to their website, you can, you know, drill down to abortion funds in specific states if you want, or you can donate to the general fund and let them help disperse the Medicaid, the resources financially. But it's a really good place to be able to provide money if that's what you feel like you can do as an advocate.
And I'll also, for funding for those who are financially able, and again, recognizing that many folks aren't. National Network of Abortion Funds, I love them. I have it set up to where I do $15 a month. And I have it set that they can just distribute it as needed, but you can select specific ones. I'd also say National Abortion Federation. When I worked as a phone counselor and funding coordinator in the clinic that I worked at, which was a first and a second trimester clinic in New Jersey, we were a NAF member. And when we had patients in need, we would reach out to NAF and they would cut the cost of procedures in half for us. And then we were able to try to reach out to smaller funds to get other amounts and to work with patients to raise the remaining costs. But as a NAF member clinic, the vast majority of our funding came directly from them as well. National Network of Abortion Funds can cover more practical things, and they're willing to give you the $300 for the hotel where NAF can't. But NAF, National Abortion Federation, is also a great place if you are able to donate.
And I'm going to just flip back, and certainly if people have other questions, please do. But this is a quote from one of the members of the Jane Collective. Just looking through that, she said, we took something that could be horrible for women and turned it into something that was empowering and life affirming. I think the possibility of transformation is there today as it was 50 years ago. And she said, in fact, I'm interested to see what young people come up with as a way to address our current situation. I know they're finding ways. And then she also said, I think the important piece is that ordinary people working together can make a big difference in the world and change people's lives. It's the choices we make. It's the opportunities we're afforded. A lot of life is what you say yes to. So I found that to be inspirational.
Well, thank you both so much for your time and for your answering all of these wonderful questions. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. It is good to know that despite all of the hard things that are happening around such important rights that have already been fought for time and time again, that despite all that hard stuff, it is good to know that there are so many people in our community that care about this, and are here getting this information. If anybody has any follow-up questions or anything like that, feel free to email me through the church website. So that is dre@uuneedham.org. And I will make sure that you get answers to that. I'll make sure Kari or Tracy funnel through me and answer for you. We want to make sure you have good information to the questions that you have. And with that, thank you again, Kari and Tracy.
And I second that. It's wonderful that you were able to give us your time and help us understand what's going on. And it's really such an important topic. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful night.